David Bohm Seminar Series 1, November 12th, 1988, Saturday afternoon, 4 o'clock session, Ojai, California.
Right, so I think we could begin if anybody wants to discuss or raise any questions on whatever came before and anything else. So perhaps we could begin that way, so to see that we're all in communication. Before going ahead into something else.
Let's see. I think you wound up saying that the problem was what was underlying this whole thing that we've been talking about. That there was a deeper level that we have to understand before we go from there. Something like that?
Well, I'm saying that, yes, we're sort of probing, digging deeper into the nature of thought. The trouble arises in something deeper. Either think of its roots being deep, or you can think of moving up toward the source of the stream, or either deeper or further toward the source or something, right? And the idea being the source will also be something very general. See, I suggested that the general is more active than the particular at this level. It's implicit, and that the source would probably be very general, the most general. The source would be the source of everything, right?
Well, see, one thing I wanted to know, in the, you were talking about I call it the implicate order. Am I getting the pronunciation properly?
That's all right, yes.
Okay. Let's see, are these errors that we're talking about, those would not be in the implicate order?
What?
That's surface stuff, isn't it?
Well, it comes out on the surface, but you can't separate the two. Somewhere there's something wrong further down. It might not be at the very source, but it's close. You see, I like this image of the stream being polluted, right? Somebody might pollute it fairly far upstream, and then further downstream people are troubled by this and they try to remove it. It's like correcting particular errors while the basic general errors remain, right? So it's no use correcting the particular errors while the general ones remain. We find ourselves driven to make the same mistakes again and again, or same kind of mistakes, right?
Are you suggesting that there's not much purpose even to go further upstream?
Oh, there is.
Because we don't still have the source of it.
Well, no, we may find that there's a source of this problem, but we have to keep on moving upstream to get it more general, you see. We are looking constantly at the thing in a more too particular and limited a way.
But if you're getting at the source, you want to get at the source of the stream. Then if you're still in the river, even though you're going upriver, you may be getting closer to the source, but that's not getting you at the source. You want to get at the source.
Well, eventually, but for the moment, we're sort of moving up into the upstream to get an insight into what is happening, right? Now, if we say the word source could have two connotations here. You see, one would be the source of everything, the ultimate source, we'll call it. Or another would be, there might be a place where the pollution is primarily going in. You see, that at some level of thought which doesn't reach the ultimate source of all existence, right? And let's say that those are the possibilities, right? Now, that in what we call the implicit order, there is something going off a bit. It's working, and it gets bigger and bigger as we go downstream. Now, downstream we can see the results and we can see the evidence, but we have to have insight to go upstream, right? Into something deeper and more general. Now, perhaps we will eventually even say something about the ultimate source, you see, but that we would like to go into this stuff first.
What you're saying is, maybe it's that the pollution may be some contributory, but the source of the essence of all the implicate order, which is what is good and bad, is further up.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, but the general spirit is to move upstream, which means moving toward the more inclusive in the general, rather than the limited in the particular problems. Now, a minute. Okay. Is there anything else anybody wants to raise?
We were discussing, a question came up at lunch. Someone says, well, if anything that's implicate in your brain is something that you learned that was explicate as a child. And we were wondering if there was anything, maybe one person said, well, maybe there's something biologically implicate or inherited through the brain or something like that that was of this nature, rather than just like, when the parent says something that's explicate and the child inherits.
Things in, right? Yeah, well, I think there is not only the biological structure, but also there's something deeper even than that, which is accessible in principle, but we may be not really allowing it to come through because the other stuff, the pollution, is so prevalent. You see that it blocks everything, or it prevents us from seeing. I gave last year the example: if you're in Las Vegas and all the lights are on, you can't see the universe. You see, you think that Las Vegas is the universe, right? A strange universe, and the universe shows up in the very faint, subtle things, and not in the tremendously powerful, bright, noisy things, right? So therefore, the mind has to get quieter and subtler. But we have to see this pollution, whatever we want to call it, which is stirring it up all the time. And you see, by stirring it up all the time, it's making it hard to see what the source of the trouble is. It sort of hides. The trouble is the kind of trouble that hides itself behind all the fuss that it makes, right? And so you can't find it, right?
Like a magician.
That's just what a magician does, you see, that he makes a tremendous amount of patter and movements, and meanwhile he does his little trick.
David, I remember once you used an analogy about the film 2001, about unplugging Hal.
Yeah,
about slowing down the program.
Yes, that was an interesting insight, I think, in 2001 AD. That you see, when the computer began to destroy everything, the man went in, and he went into the very heart of the computer, and he took a screwdriver and started to disconnect it. And while he was disconnecting it, the thing slowed down, and began to plead, saying, "Okay, I'll be a good boy from now on," and so on. And but he didn't listen. See, he just unplugged the computer. You see, so the idea is that this is a kind of mechanical process, and somehow we must. It won't be as simple as a screwdriver. We must not give it energy. You see. It's the same thing when it counts with disease, not to give the viruses the capacity to multiply, right? That is, the blood is a wonderful medium for viruses, and the whole point of the immune system is not to allow them to multiply. There are many analogies you can give, right?
Well, now this is an oldie, but how about it? If we quiet the mind, which you mentioned before, well, you said space in here for us to do our thing. Well, suppose we put space in the head, well, let's slow down the computer.
It all goes together. Slowing down the computer opens up the space, the leisure. See, when you're occupied, the opposite of leisure is occupation, right? So when you're highly occupied, there's no leisure, no empty space, right? That's the noise. You see, if the occupation is just futile and unnecessary, just going on, then empty, then it's pointless, rather. Then you can say there's no point. Is there some occupation that has a meaning, right? You have to do it, right? But most of what's going on in the mind is really very little meaning, and it just goes on, right, like a machine. So let's say that occupation goes away, it stops working, and then there is space, you see. That there is space, and there is a sensitivity, and for subtlety, for perceiving something deeper, right, or more fundamental, or closer to the origin, or whatever we want to put it.
Except that all that occupation seems to be the meaning of my life.
Yes, well, we can go into that, but you see, what we're doing now is why this happens. You see, we're asking a question implicitly. Why does it happen? It's general, right? So therefore, the point you raise is significant because it's very general. And why should occupation be the meaning of our lives? You see, because thought has taken over, especially the kind of thought we're talking about, which emphasizes literal thought and so on. And you could say that if you keep on working in this mechanical literal domain, you get rather bored and you want to be occupied, and that the more you are occupied, the more the machine works, and so on. You get caught in it. Right? Now, I think we have to ask why do we accept this? You see, why don't we stop being occupied? You see, so that's a question. I'm not answering it, but right away.
Acceptance sounds like a conscious decision.
Oh, I don't want to make it. I'm just saying, ponder the question, you see. It's like saying the kind of sensitivity that would start to feel out the process, right? Saying, instead of answering the question, we suspend the answer, hold it back, and just see what happens inside, right? When you put that question.
One of the ways that this inquiry often goes wrong is it becomes a new occupation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, that's true. That's always the case, that the whole human race, that almost everything the human race has done to try to solve this problem has made it worse. Because the reason is very simple, because in trying to do something about it, it has used the very same process which it should stop, right? But in a more subtle way, which it didn't notice, right? I gave some examples of that this morning, if you remember.
Has it made it worse? I think we have to be very careful that we each have the power of choice. Every human being has the power of choice, and we're choosing to see it as worse.
Right. Well, let's try to put it like this. Religion, I'll give you what I mean, right? Let's take an elementary example, religion, right, which was aimed at helping people to be good and be in tune with the universe and with God or whatever they meant, right? And really had a very good purpose. But yet it became organized, priests and hierarchy and so on. They began, that people not only fought over it and slaughtered each other over it, but they frightened each other with religious ideas, of hell and punishment, and the gods will punish you and so on. And I think it added to the problem in the long run. You see, it may have helped in the short run. So I think most of these things, it seems clear that the problem became more complex and difficult the further you went along that line. I won't use the word worse, but I mean, in some ways something happened there which you got more of the same, only spread out into another area.
That means that we're using thought to try and solve the problem when we need to let it go and get something from another source.
Yes, and if the mind would quiet down and so on. But you see, that those ifs don't help us, you see, because then if it doesn't immediately quiet down, when you're advised that it should quiet down, then you're stuck with the problem. You say, then it becomes my aim, my end, to quiet it down. I must find the means of quieting it down, which will be various means. I may do all sorts of things to quiet it down, but every one of those things I'm doing is more of the same, right? You see, you keep on falling into this trap of using the thing which you are trying to bring to an end, right? Using it to try to bring it to an end.
So no matter which way I move, if I move, that will be the case. So with the question then be, are some wrong movements more useful than other wrong movements?
Well, we don't know, you see. The trouble is it's very subtle. That's one of the subtle traps, that you could say this movement may be wrong, but it's better than the other one. But it may be that in the end it comes to the same thing, you see. That we don't know, you see, because further back somewhere, this movement starts, I have my attention on something, and further back another movement starts, which is of the same quality as I'm trying to get rid of, right? You see, that the looker, the observer, is the same quality as the observed, right? Has the same ground, the same source.
So is there a situation or a format where people can engage in something as we're engaged in something, Or we can't fool ourselves.
Well, we can always fool ourselves, you see, but I think we are going, if we have the serious intention, to do it right, to not to do that sort of thing, we may get trapped in it, but then we'd have to just keep on working. You see, if you're trying to ride a bicycle, for example, you will fall many times, but then eventually you learn, right? You see, every time you fall, you don't say, well, look, I've fallen, I better stop. But rather, you see, we may discover that we do fool ourselves from time to time, but then we say that's just another thing we have got to look at, right?
Is there some way of knowing when we fooled ourselves?
Well, the feeling that you fooled yourself is almost the only way. If there are a lot of us here, it will make it easier because it's usually easier for somebody else to see that you're fooling yourself. Not always, but because there can be a collective delusion as well. There have been many, right?
More specifically, is there some sensation, something which arises within consciousness, which is a signal that?
Well, don't you say when something is wrong, you get a feeling, right? It's very subtle. Now that's why we shouldn't be too occupied, because if you're highly occupied, you'll miss that, right?
To me, that we're constantly getting signals. It's just that we have a tremendous barrier against acknowledging them because we would have to change them.
Yeah, well, there may be even a wish not to acknowledge it and so on. You see, because we're frightened of change, or we don't want to change. You see, that it's all part of that process. Now, I think though that if we go in this direction, we can find an infinite elaboration of complexity. See, so really, we'd like to get to the heart of the thing, the core, the origin. That's what I'm suggesting. It's worth looking at this. At times you should look at it, but I'm saying that there is a limited time. You see, I think we could spend, say, several days just going into this, right?
The stage is reached, can be reached when the mind or the thought capitulates.
What?
When the mind or the thought capitulates, we cannot find any solution.
Well, that may be, but that doesn't, it may or may not. You see, the mind may still go on seeking a solution, you see, unconsciously, implicitly. See, the trouble is that our thought is mostly implicit, and we are deeply committed as a species to seek a solution to problems. We have done it for a very long time, right? And it's sort of embedded in us.
Another thing is to realize that there is a fault in the human brain.
Maybe there is or maybe there isn't. You see, if we assume there's a fault, that's only an assumption. We have no proof. And it makes it may just simply make us stop, because we'd say, if the brain is faulty, I have no idea what to do. Maybe someday there will be an evolution of a better brain, or maybe the genetic engineers will do it, but but their brains may be faulty too, and they will produce something worse, right? So you could depend on nature, but see, selection is not working. What we do is we keep alive the faulty specimens, and therefore, unless we were totally ruthless and got rid of anything, but even then we'd say we would have to judge who is to live and who is not to. And again, it would, from the faulty brain you cannot proceed, right? But that's an assumption. So I'm saying that it's not a good approach to make such an assumption. You see, it probably is not true. If it is true, it's really hopeless, and in view of the fact that there's no way to know that it's true, we had better not make that assumption, I'd say, and see, to leave it open, right?
Assumption is based on the fact that it's very hard, or perhaps it's impossible, to distinguish what is psychological and what is biological. If we come over from, we accept a psychological fact as a biological fact.
Yes, that's true, but I agree that the two pass into each other, but it works both ways, that the biological affects the psychological, but I also say the psychological affects the biological, that insight will change the operation of the brain, and lack of insight will produce eventually a degeneration of the structure of the brain. And that's what I'm saying, that there is no separation ultimately between the psychological and the biological. And many scientists are ready to accept that, but they say only the biological is real. The psychological follows on that, but I'm suggesting that may not be so. Maybe both ways, that the psychological also affects the biological. That's an idea we could entertain. Now, that's something which will come up as we go along. So, therefore, a brain which lacks insight into how it works is going to degenerate biologically. If it has insight, it may change. Now,
everything, I think, is ultimately psychological.
Maybe, but
I mean, but I think if you look at your worldview, all of the years, it says that.
Yeah, so eventually it's certainly there. I'm suggesting they pass into each other and that they participate. I would rather use the word mutual participation of the two sides, you see. That I think, perhaps I could proceed from that point that we were discussing participation before, and participation is a different way of looking at the world and experiencing it. The people who in the past thought in terms of participation experienced a different world than we do. That's in some sense, and the way we experience the world depends on our general thoughts about it, right? So, if there is participation, then everything participates everything. That is, it partakes of everything and takes part in everything, so that the very being of each thing arises in that participation. So that includes us especially. So that we in this room are participating, and each one of us is partaking of the whole, and also contributing in some way. And that this is what was meant in my book about the implicate order. It's another way of looking at it, saying everything enfolds everything. And now that would suggest also that what we call biological participates psychological and vice versa. That they are merely convenient divisions, distinctions, rather than real separations, right?
If you stuck a probe in the human brain, it's not able to feel it. That's a natural biological thing. It's almost as if the self, which is psychological thinking, in a similar way, is not aware of itself, and that's the source.
Yes, it may be, but you see, I think that that's a very complex question. Perhaps perhaps I'll proceed a little now and explain, go on with what I was going to say, because I think it all ties up. You see that we're saying now about participation. Now, you see, if we come back to this question of thought, we've discussed various kinds of thought at a deeper level. And you see, one important point about thought is that thought is an abstraction, is always abstraction, you see. See, literal thought might have claimed eventually not to be abstraction, but to be just a faithful copy of what is. But every thought is an abstraction, you see. Now, that's the first thing we have to notice, that abstract means literally to take out. It takes out from the concrete context of the actual perception and experience. Something is abstracted. Now, it's clear that whatever you think about, it cannot cover everything that would be in the thing, right? There's always more, right? And it's always somewhat different. There's always surprises, huh? That you don't have everything in thought, right? You see, the thought clearly is an abstraction. The thought of this rose lacks many of the qualities, most of the qualities of the rose. It has some of them, at least in some similarity, right? Now, so thought is an abstraction, and literal thought has this problem in it that implicitly it's trying to say that it's seeking the ideal of not being an abstraction, but just being another copy of what is, right? And not taking out anything, not leaving out anything, right? So I think you can see that yes, there's always more, and we could say, therefore, by means of thought, we could not capture the whole, right? That's what I'm suggesting. We can always get more. You see, there's no limit to thought which you can set, because people could always discover more. Scientists could discover more and more and more. But it's always limited. It's limited because it doesn't get all, right? The word limit means the same as boundary, finite. See, the word finite is just Latin for limit. Finish is the same root. Definite means the same thing. Definition, to define, to set the limits, right? And something which is infinite has no limits, right? Now, there are several kinds of infinite. You see, there are several kinds of limits. You see, there's the quantitative limit, the size of it, right? Or else the number of degrees or the number of whatever. There's the qualitative limit. You see that everything is limited by its qualities. In order to be what it is, it can't be something else. You see a rock cannot be a tree, right? And a goat cannot be a sheep, and so on, all the way around, right? So therefore, we have qualitative limits, and everything is defined. And then besides that, everything has limited capacity to take its action. Right? Everything can do something, but it can only do some limited thing, right? It can't do everything. So you have all those limits, and now those limits are represented by categories, you see. We say the sheep are in one category. You put everything together which belongs together and call it sheep, or call it rock, or call it whatever, and then something else is the goats are put in another category, right? And, so therefore thought works by categories and gives a name to each category. And then categories are put together into more general categories, and so on, into animals and so on, all the way up. The most general category, a very general one, might be matter as a whole, right? Now, which physics deals with, right? Or energy. There's this kind of energy, that kind of energy, that kind of energy, and then there's energy, right? Now every category implies a limit. Every name implies a limit, right? And we're saying that thought determines limits. It's an abstraction. You see, it's something limited, but even that limit is an abstraction. Like, for example, the limit between two fields is a line. But it's an abstraction. See, the fields really are one, right? We have said it. We may draw a dotted line on a map and say that's the limit of the country, but you see, there is no. Right? Even when we say this chair is limited, it's an abstraction because at the atomic level it sort of shades into the air, into the surroundings. So at the level at which we're working, that abstraction is okay, right? But it's adequate. So we've got everything limited that way, and we have everything in categories, right? And thought works that way. Now, that means that whatever we think anything is, it isn't, right? It can't be. So the thought, however, may guide our action. It may constitute a guide or a map of some sort, right? If it's correct. Now, all of these things are relevant when we're talking about the thoughts we're talking about. What about, whether we can do all sorts of things. You see, what is the thing biological? Is it psychological, right? The two are concepts. Biological is one, psychological is another. They're both thoughts, right? You cannot find the biological by looking for it. I mean, it doesn't exist, right? Not as a concrete thing. Nor does the psychological. They're both abstractions. The limits between them are abstractions.
They're abstractions simply because we named them, right?
Yes, thought cannot do other than make abstractions. It's simply because thought makes them. The process of thought works by making abstractions. You see, now these abstractions are then organized to give rise to concepts, right? Now,
that whole mechanism of seeing similarities and differences between groups is where categories come from. That seems to be inherent in the organ brain as a natural evolutionary over millions of years maybe, and it's gone over into thinking.
Yes, and it was necessary. You see, even the animal does that, right? The animal can select things that are similar, the food that it needs, and distinguish them from things that are different, right? So that distinction arises at a deeper level than thought. It is still a kind of abstraction, even when the animal does it. But the human being carries it further into concepts and names, and for the sake of communication, and to organize it into much more complex structures, right? And to hold it. See, the animal cannot hold an abstract category in its mind, right? It can't remember sufficiently, such a thing. So the
thought is sort of a function of existence, and now it has sort of turned itself into existence.
Yeah, you can begin to see how thought would develop. You see, thought is a part of existence, right? It's going on electrically and chemically, and it's not people used to think maybe it was totally spiritual or not, but we now know at least it must have a very important component that is material, right?
It seems to make us unaware of the rest of existence.
Well, yes, because thought is occupying a central part in our structure. You see, now you see, thought can produce something similar to perception, the experience similar to perception, but different. It will produce imagination, for example. We're going to go into that later. And it can sort of stir up everything in the way it also is connected with felt and with physical movements and so on. By thinking, you can decide to carry out a physical movement. So there must be a connection between thought and your physical movement, right? It must be possible for thought to, whatever nerves are required to get your muscles moving, thought must find a way of getting them to fire, right? It's actually doing that physically. And Eccles, a man called Eccles, has shown that when you have an intention to do something, you may be conscious of the intention at a certain stage, but before you are conscious of it, electrical activity is recorded for a short period of a fraction of a second before you are conscious of it. As you're forming an intention, something is happening in the brain that you're not yet conscious of, right? I might call that the implicate order or something, you see. But, so that your intention to act it cannot be separated from the physical, right? And and all of that is thought. Now, see, let's talk around this a while. The thought not only forms abstractions, and forms higher and higher levels of abstractions. More general, it organizes them, but it forms a concept. You see, now the word concept has the root, and there's another word, percept. You see, perception. They both have the same root. The same root is the word capture, right? To take hold of. Now, perception, to perceive is to capture it thoroughly, according to the Latin root. To conceive is to capture, to take hold of it all together. The concept tries to grasp some kind of whole, right? See, so thought gets organized into concepts, which also, however, are still limited, right? Now, they're still abstractions. You can get some interesting, so I could give two examples of how a concept is formed. You see, there's the well-known case of Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf at a very early age, so that she didn't learn to talk, and she couldn't communicate. Now, this teacher, Anne Sullivan, found a way, which was to play a game with this child, constantly putting the child in contact with various things and scratching the name on the palm of the hand, right? Now, for a long time, the child didn't see the point of that game, you see. But she was picking it up, nevertheless, what was going on. Now, then, see, suddenly, one day she was exposed to water. Perhaps it was in a pail, standing still in a pail in the morning, or a little bit later, she was exposed to running water. The same name was scratched, you see. And then she suddenly had an insight, you see, which was that everything has a name. Now, as soon as she had that insight, everything changed. She was able to learn language, make sentences in a short time, and to communicate. Right? Now, whereas before she had been, as it was said, like a wild animal. Now, there was a tremendous difference. And you see, this insight that everything has a name, she had before she had the word name, right? It was a nonverbal insight about the word, right? Now, and there was a further point. See, she could have seen this by saying, not only does it hold for water, that the same name was scratched, the same feelings were on her hand, water in the pump and water running. The experience of that is apparently very different, right? If you don't know anything about it. And she was wondering, why should such different things have the same, why was this woman scratching the same thing for two such different experiences, right? That was, you see, that was the puzzle, right? That's the way insight arises, to see something that's very puzzling, something not making sense. And then suddenly it made sense, because it was all one substance, water. I mean, with the name, as she saw it was all water, that there were two forms of water, and with room for any number of forms of water, right? She could keep on adding to that concept according to experience, right? And to talking and communicating. She could be told about it and so on. So you could begin to build up the concept of water, but it was a much bigger revolution, because she had the concept of the concept. That is, she had the source of it, right? That she saw that it was possible to do this for anything, which clearly was due to the fact that this game had been played for several weeks, or whatever it was. And she could see that it was all the same, right? That therefore, not merely water, but everything could be done that way. See, so that was something very general, an insight, and you can see that insight is a nonverbal activity which transformed her life, right? Now, we now say maybe we're too much in concepts and we should get out of it. We may need another insight. But see, if we didn't get into concepts, we would never have been able to raise these questions at all. I mean, if we had stayed at the level she was, we probably couldn't survive, right? So the...
Are you saying that we can arrive at an insight through concept? Is that how I'm understanding?
I'm saying no, she didn't have... The insight was into the concept, right? She didn't know about, she had a kind of concept, she probably had concepts, but none which had names, right? Right? Now,
water on a non-verbal basis was still the same.
Yes, well, but she didn't know about water. You see, it's very important that she didn't know that running water was the same as standing water. We can tell that with our eyes by watching how running water becomes standing water, right? But she could never do that.
Tactilely.
Oh, but it'd be almost impossible, you see. How do you see running water turning into standing water, or vice versa, you see? It's because now it was entirely due to the name being scratched that she could see that they're the same, different forms of the same thing, right? Now,
although she did have prior experience with those forms of water, right?
She had, but she didn't know they were water. You see, she said, these are two different things. I don't know. She had no way of knowing they were the same thing. You see, now the concept brings together all the things that belong together, you see, and that distinguished it from other things which belong apart, because the minute she knew she could make other concepts like a tree or, or a house or something, or whatever, teacher, which are not water, right? So therefore, it became possible to bring a new order into her life and organize it and to communicate. You see, because she had the name, she could communicate it, right? Now, the name has a tremendous and powerful effect, you see. Without the name, it would never have worked. Right?
She must have had to come across the realization that there was such a thing as the ability to conceptualize.
Well, she may have conceptualized before on the basis of some experience, but she could never attach a name to it.
This has to generate usually at a young age, and once you have that ability to understand that there's conceptualization, then all this other stuff like language and everything falls into place. Without that, it would be just, where would it come from?
Yeah. Now, see, notice that was done by abstraction, you see, because the difference of running and standing water is an abstraction, right? And the fact that you put them together, or keep certain things apart or put things together, it's entirely at the level of abstraction. And it was through the name that you can call it up again, right? And add to it and change it and so on, develop it, connect it to other concepts, you see, and begin the process of thinking, you see, in an organized way, which was communicable, and so that you could then pick up other people's thoughts, and you could begin to engage in the whole process. And she became quite good at it and went to the university and did all sorts of things which people can do, you see, once they pick this up, right? Now
I just like to help me to make it clear the bridge between the moment where there was disorganization and then there was insight, or if I may use those words loosely. What would you say again? What was the move? What was the? It wasn't the name. That we're just giving that as an example in this particular case. But in general, what would be the movement that would?
Well, if you can get a feeling for it, you see, can you put yourself in her place? Use the imagination, right?
Yeah.
And say, okay, you can't see anything, you can't hear anything, you've never heard of names, right? You don't know what they are. You may have some sort of concepts, but they may be just whatever formed by experience in some accidental way. Like food might be a concept, right? That you could recognize somehow. You would know this is food, right? Because of the similar experience all the time. So that when you're hungry and then you get food, right? Now, but then that's very limited, right? Now then, suppose you were going through this experience of touching all sorts of things, getting different experiences, and having a common experience for certain of those touches, right?
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
See, I'm trying to discuss see, every time we touched this object, there was a different. It feels different as you touch it in different places, right? But the same scratch is on there.
Well, there was a commonality, right?
Well, there was, but she didn't see it. You know, she didn't see the point of it at all.
Right, and then.
Right?
Yeah. But is it to concept that the, I asked that before and I'm afraid I didn't understand why I don't understand. Was it to concept that the insight?
No, the insight was first.
Okay, then I'm
But
fine.
I said it was an insight into concepts.
There was such thing as a concept.
But there is such a thing as a concept with a name, right?
Okay, I got it.
You see, that's not, you see, in other words, given her lack of experience and her lack of communication, most children pick this up very quickly, you see, because there's so many ways of communicating it. But given her particular background, she didn't know this, right?
Never know that there was such a thing as a concept through touching things and so on. It was only by taking those various experiences,
And naming, giving them the same name. You see, now, if you have vision, you could make such a concept without having a name, because you see other similarities. For example, you can see the form looks similar, or you can see this running water slows down and becomes standing water. You see, with the aid of vision, quite a few concepts could form, but you couldn't communicate them. Right? Now, except in a very limited way, right? Now, so the point is that there you have an example of insight. And you see, which changed her life. And she might not have survived if she hadn't had that insight, right? So now, I can't describe the insight, but you can try to put yourself in her place and see what it might have felt like, right?
You've ever been exposed to a language whose origins are not your own, at all related to your own, either the written or the spoken language, you can sense this because you have no idea what people are talking about. Or if you try to read Chinese characters and you're not familiar with them, it's like means nothing. There's no source for identifying anything that would make sense to you personally.
Yes, in language, in acquiring any language, you have to go through something like that, and suddenly you understand it. You see that, but this was a far more difficult thing. You see, and
so it would seem, I don't know if this is relevant, that in order for insight to take place, there would seem to have to be a period of abeyance where you're just kind of quiet or puzzled, and then something may connect and it may not. You couldn't reach out through your thinking to have insight.
No, but thinking takes part in it. You see that, for example, the teacher was doing some very good thinking, although it may have been intuitive. Right? She didn't say it in words, but she must have sensed that this was the key problem. You see, in other words, why did she scratch the name? You see, And in other words, that therefore there was some very, in order to communicate this point, some very clear thinking some very good thinking had to take place. Right?
Right. No, of course, but in Helen Keller, it was her puzzlement or her abeyance in the face of these experiences,
right.
which was the fertile
That's
ground.
right. Well, in other words, if you find that something is happening that doesn't fit the scheme of things, then that scheme stops operating, right?
So, in this situation, if everything fits the scheme of things, we're stuck.
Yeah, but the world is full of things that don't fit the schema, you see. And, we're always encountering it.
But we might be predisposed to fit things into the scheme of things, even when they don't fit.
Yeah, that's our trouble, yes. If we were free to notice that they're not fitting, then we would have the insight.
So you were predisposed to conceptualize
concepts. Well, even not even that. We're rejecting the evidence that it is not fitting. You see, it's not the conceptualization. It's stuff that may be just one of the tricks by which we avoid looking at the fact that it doesn't fit. You see, if suppose you say, look, you may get some evidence that your prejudices are not right, huh? But you don't want to take that seriously, right? So you could say, well, only it's true, some people of that group are okay, but the rest are not, right? You start to conceptualize to explain it away. You can explain the evidence away by conceptualizing it, right? In a certain way, but it's not because it's a concept that it's wrong, it's because your deep intention is not to pay any attention to the evidence, right? Because you want to defend whatever is there.
This naming is so strong that someone as great as Shakespeare would say, he who steals from my purse steals trash, but he who steals my good name steals everything.
And he also said a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet.
You see, there are several things you can say that you know that.
If he said that he who steals my good name steals everything, well, the name, my name, personal, not the water, but you build your own image of yourself, which is your name, but really it's shot full of holes, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's a very subtle and complex question. You see, like children say, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. But in fact, people are hurt by names. You see, so it isn't clear. You see, something is going wrong. Now, the thing that you have just called attention to is that the self is a concept. I mean, that the name, if the name is taken that seriously, that I'm really stealing my name, you hurt me. Therefore, it must be the concept that is hurt.
Well, aren't you telling us that we are all Helen Kellers, and in order to solve the human problem, we've got to have a concept we haven't yet had?
Well, we may have to. I'll look at it the other way. We've got some concepts implicit concepts which are in the way. So we're trying to bring them out, right? That's the first step. And we may contrast them with other concepts which are better, but the insight goes beyond the concept, right?
We need to do this primary work first.
Yeah. Okay. We've got to let these concepts be seen, because otherwise they are implicit and they work, and no matter what our intentions are, they're going to work the same, right? You may say, I realize how silly it is to be hurt by name calling, right? No, it's the silliest thing in the world, but if somebody calls me a name, I'll still be hurt, right? It won't change it, huh? You see, so that doesn't prove it's right to respond that way, but it shows we have to understand that there's something going on there that we have to bring out.
Want to see this aspect, because that's part of the nature of the problem.
Yeah.
We have problems.
Yeah. See, being hurt by name is extremely silly, but wars have been fought over, right? Duels have been fought over, everything, and people have really become enemies.
Well, the machinery of that is that our self-image is charged, and so if somebody presents another charged image, they collide and I get hurt.
Yes, but why should I take it that seriously? You see, if it's only a name and a concept, I mean, why should it bother me? You see, a concept is an abstraction.
If you kick me, you've hurt me. But if
that's exactly what this children's rhyme says.
If you call me a name, I'm hurting myself with it.
That's true. Well, it's the concept that's hurting you. You see, you're not doing it intentionally, but the concept is working. You see, it's like a piece of machinery inside. Just as your liver works, your concepts work. I'm not saying concepts are good or bad. We're trying to just look at them. They're necessary. They have all sorts of good points, and we couldn't live without them, but they can cause us a lot of trouble, right?
Are you saying concepts are a group of thoughts?
Well, they're organized thoughts, you see, but they're organized around the name, right? At least the kind we're talking about. Or a symbol in general. You know, it could have a cross or a figure, you know, anything that's recognizable can stand for the name, right? Now, but if we put the name as a word, we can communicate it by talking. Otherwise, we might communicate it by writing or by drawing figures or by gestures or in various other ways. See, a gesture could become the name, right? Now, you see, the name is crucial because the name calls up the concept, right? And also the concept calls up the name, and the name communicates the concept. You see, it makes it possible for us to communicate because all that I'm saying is words which communicate concepts to you, right? Now, these concepts, if we stop there, they're empty, you see, but they have a meaning. The meaning we've got to see, which is behind it, right? Which may be greater. But these concepts are abstraction, right? But somehow there's a meaning, we're saying, behind it, right? Now, literal thought would just stick with the concept, saying the concepts are all that we're communicating, and the thing in reality is just the same as the concept, right? That's literal thought. Now, we have poetic thought, which is much more ambiguous. It doesn't have a sharply defined concept, right? And then we have this participatory thought, you know, in which concepts play a different role. You know, that really the actual participation, the concept, the occasion for starting some participation. Right? That's all different kinds of thought, you see. And now, you see, we have to be careful not to condemn concepts per se, because we couldn't do anything without them. In the same way we can't condemn memory, we would be idiots without, you know, we would not be able to have one connected action without them, without memory, you see. So, but something is going wrong with concepts, as it is going wrong with memory, as it is going wrong with emotions, and so on. It's all one process. That concepts are being used for self-deception. They're being used to cover up things, instead of being used properly.
That the concepts are wrong, or they're being used wrongly?
They're being used wrongly, and some of them are wrong themselves, but in addition, the main point is they're being used wrongly.
Confused with what's real.
Yes, that's literal thought.
If a concept is used for what's real, it's never going to work.
Yes, because concept is an abstraction. It's limited, right.
Thought being all wrapped up in literal thought, being wrapped up in itself like that, it doesn't even have any relationship with what's, quote, real.
Well, not fundamentally. You see, in a certain area, we can make thought that's fairly literal in the technical area. But it's not absolutely so, because none of our machines are exactly what we think they are, right? They break down, you see. They don't do what they're supposed to do. They have little faults in them. Anyway, they have an atomic structure which we don't know about, and they have all sorts of things, you see. But, so that's an abstraction, you see.
Confuse that abstraction for reality.
Yes, because of literal thought, right? The same thing, right?
Literal thought can convince us to see a picture of forest and take it as a forest, and almost smell the perfume of the pine trees.
As what?
And it may have the power, the literal thought, to convince us that a picture of forest is a real forest.
Yes, that picture contains everything significant that the forest contains, right?
And the power to deceive.
Yes, well, it has the power, you know, the power to deceive is deeper. I mean, that will not go without the intention to deceive, you see. That this concept by itself doesn't necessarily deceive. There's a deeper intention to engage in self-deception in order to defend something, you see. therefore, we can say now, we say thought can be organized into concepts and produce tremendous concepts like time and space and physical concepts, relativity theory, quantum theory, and all these concepts, right? The structures of concepts. And they have great power, you see, when they're used properly. And they produce the concept of the self, the concept of the country, the concept of everything, you see. But we don't see this happening. You see, we don't. This is what we'll perhaps try to look at in the next hour. We don't see how it comes about that we're fooled by these concepts, and why these names hurt us is just even more than sticks and stones, right? We don't see why this happens. Huh? You see, it's rather silly. We all agree that names shouldn't matter that much, but names are the names of concepts. You see, whatever they call you in the name, there's a concept in it, isn't there? It's not just the word. And and that concept hurts, you see. Now, apparently it has a solidity and a reality and a power, which in some way must be false, you see, because it's only an abstraction. Right? If we don't get that straight, then see, that's getting close to the core of the problem, right? That we can't see what would be meant by reality or by anything. The process is not reliable, you see. We can get caught up in concepts mistaken for reality very quickly.
It's playing false rather than playing true.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's playing false, you see.
That's pretty much where we live.
Well, that's where the trouble. See, I tried to say that yesterday night. You see that we have this mess going on, and that's it, right? You see, nationalism is a concept, right? It's you see, since this last war, a lot of nations have been created. They never existed before, right? They were clearly created as concepts, right? Now, since then, they seem very solid and real. People fight over them and die over them and argue. The boundaries are very sharp, and so on.
We mistake the word for the thing. So when we say my country, right or wrong, but my country, what are we saying that's real?
Well, I don't know. You see, that's what we have to look to. Ourselves, myself, right or wrong, is the same thing. You see, people say me first, right? But what is meant by that? You say number one comes first. You see, the point is, what does it mean? What does me mean? That's what we have to go into.
Does it have to do with value?
It has to do with value because me has a supreme value, or my country, or whatever, right?
That changes this concept into something more than just the concept.
Well, the concept always has value, and it affects us. Or, see, but this has a tremendously high value, which has a very big effect. Right?
You attack my words, you attack my values, and I'll slug you.
Yeah, but it doesn't make sense. You see, I'm trying to say we really have got to get deeper and say we can't accept this, really inevitable, but question it. What is behind it? You see.
To realize that it's really wrong, like you're talking about, in essence, the deep root of it. To see that it's wrong, it's already changed its nature.
We have begun to change its nature, but it will easily slip back if we don't go deeper, you see. Now, somebody can say, I see how wrong it is to be affected by names, but somebody will say an insulting name and he'll still be affected, you see. It has to go deeper.
Humanity is gullible. Goebbels said, if you repeat a lie often enough, you believe it yourself. So people accept lies.
Yes, so that's part of the whole thing, that the concept becomes reality, you see. That is, the lie is a certain concept, right?
Pointed out earlier that the might have something to do with the identification of the self with the name and the value.
Yes, it's all beginning to point to that, you see. But it's important to notice the power of the name. You see, even though we know it shouldn't have that power, but still it's got it.
As long as the category of the self contains certain qualities, whatever challenges that is obviously implicitly going to affect that category.
Yes, well,
I mean, it's automatic.
yes, well, if there's the category of the self and, the concept of the self, and somebody says something that takes away another concept which takes away the value of it, then there's going to be a powerful reaction. You see, if somebody says, the concept of the self, maybe I'm very wise and capable and can do everything right, and somebody says that's all wrong, you're an idiot, right? That's a different concept, right? There are two concepts which don't agree, right? That concept will upset the whole system that you had there, which was producing a nice neurochemical state all over the body, and therefore it disturbs the whole body, right?
The thing that relaxes is even the thing that responds is another concept.
Yes.
There must be concepts on top of concepts.
Well, it keeps moving, you see, that the concepts are not working properly. Right?
So are you trying to create a new concept by what we're talking about?
No, we're just looking at it, you see. I'm trying to say we're sort of digging into the thought process and trying to get a feeling for how it works, right?
The feeling I'm getting is that our individual perception of reality is all based on our individual conceptualization of what is.
Yeah, but most of our individual conceptualizations are collective. You see, that's the second point, and that's what we'll discuss in the next hour. You see, we have the concept that they're individual, but it's a wrong concept of it.
Collision of concepts in the mind seem to be handled in the mind instead of on the battlefield. Is that part of it?
Yes, because concepts have power. Concepts with high value have power, right? And if they collide, then a tremendous amount of power is released in a conflict. Huh?
At this point...
Maybe the thought has invented the high values to empower itself.
It has, you see, that's part of the memory too. I mean, it builds up collectively that such and such is important, right?
And then people come with a level now that they are spiritual, for instance.
What?
I mean, it's a phenomenon of the New Age specifically, that people come, convince themselves that they are spiritual, so they put that level, and it's a tremendous power that you look at them, and this has empowered the whole organism.
Yes, it's power, and the point is that, see, you have you have the whole culture, and then there are subcultures. Now, the New Age is the subculture of the whole culture. There are other people, other subcultures who don't like the New Age at all, right? And vice versa. So, but they share a common base, deeper. Now, the New Age subculture develops certain values with their concepts, right? They not only develop concepts about things, but they develop values, right? And they share them and build them up. And every person there is now a representative of that subculture. You see, and when those values are questioned or attacked, he feels personally his whole being is attacked, right? You see, and the same holds with nationalism and with religion and so on, you see, and with a lot of other things. Also with the concept of the self and its excellence and so on.
In this inquiry, as it goes along, it's sort of like a knife cutting through things. And as long as it's cutting through what seem to be simply mental constructions, we're very fond of it. But then, when it begins to cut the flesh, which is to say our concept experiences reality, we tend to shy away from that knife.
Yeah, that's only natural because, you see, if the body is attacked, it will demand either fighting back or getting away, right? So that response is carried over into the thought process to, see, the body feels very disturbed, and the thought process may say, we've got to stop this disturbance of the body, so we'll try to run away, change the concept to another one, or which is less disturbing, right? Saying, no, I'm not an idiot, it's those people who are idiotic, you see. They don't really understand what I'm up to, and and so on. You see that the concept is manipulated to make the body feel more comfortable, right?
Is the inquiry really moving until the inquiry begins to?
Well, it's moving on one level, and then it's got to move into another level, right? You see, I think there's so much confusion at this simple level of words and concepts. We've got to clear that up to be able to communicate, you see. That our ordinary words and concepts don't communicate this at all, you see, unless we dig into them, right? You see, if we just went to anybody on the street and started talking about this, they would say, you're crazy, right? Because the words needed to do this have not been built up, you see, with them.
It's easy to sit in this room and entertain this, but to wake up in the middle of the night and realize the implications of it, that's the time that your intention either holds and you go through all the pain and the feeling and the letting go, or that's the end of the inquiry.
Yes, well, it may not be the end, but at least it's like you've fallen off for the time being, right? What? Yeah, you've got to get back on, but we'll come to that, why the concept has that power. We've sort of indicated already in terms of values, but it's a much subtler question, I think, than that. And because that's really at the core of the self. You see, this notion of the self, which is not making sense, right? That it's not, and also the country and the religion and all those other things. Now, I think maybe if we're going to have a break, we'd better have it now, and perhaps make it very short, right? Not more than 10 minutes, right? Well, I think we'll make one more and try to go a little further ahead on this discussion. So we were saying that the thought now has concepts, it's an abstraction, it's limited, and so on. And these concepts have a name, and the name calls it up, and it all goes into play, and so on. Now, I think we can get a further insight into why this concept has such a powerful effect. If we consider the fact that thought is able to provide a representation of what we experience. That is, the word representation is a very good word because it just says to represent, to present again, right? So let us say perception presents, whatever is presented in perception, and our thought represents it in abstraction, right? A map is a kind of representation. The map is not obviously much less than the territory, but this abstraction is advantageous because it focuses on what may be important for our purposes, with all the unnecessary detail left out. It shows also it's organized, it's structured and organized in a way which may be helpful, right? And may be relevant. And so therefore, a representation is something, not just a concept, but it's a number of concepts really together to form, you see, an extreme case of the representation, the scientific representation of the world in physics. The whole mass of concepts is involved there. And you have, just simply when I talk, you can form a representation, of what it forms a representation of whatever I mean. And there are countless examples of that kind. You see that we are forming representations, right? And thought gives rise to these representations which guide us, which are abstract, right? And partial. They're limited. Now, you see, but this subject of representation is quite subtle because, of course, if you close your eyes and I describe something, some sort of representation will form in your mind, in the imagination, right, perhaps, as if it were perceived. It will not be the same as the thing. It will be very abstract compared with it. It will highlight certain points which may be of interest compared with the perception, and so on. Now, But now the thing to notice is something, the key point, that this representation is present not only in thought or in imagination, but it fuses with the actual perception and experience. Right? That it is, in other words, the representation fuses with the presentation. So that what is presented is already a large part of a representation, so it presents it again. The representation is representing representation, right? As well as some perception. It's representing a net result of perception and representation. So you see, as you think about it, you keep on thinking about the presentation, which includes the previous representation. See, the way you experience something depends on how we represent it or misrepresent it. You see, a salesman may misrepresent an object, and you will see it wrongly and buy it, right? We won't want it. It's very important, you see, that things be as represented. Right? That's part of the question of truth, right? And this, you can see, this is a serious question. This, see, just simply by naming something, you can suddenly become intensely aware of it in your perception, right? Whereas you hadn't noticed it before. It calls attention, right? You see, also a representation. You see, if you represent yourself to yourself as noble and good and capable and honest and everything that's right, and that representation enters the perception of yourself, right? That's how you perceive yourself, right? Now, somebody else gives another representation, you see, which is, dishonest, stupid, huh? You see, and that sort of goes in too and is perceived. Now that shakes up, as I said before, that shakes up the whole system, the whole neurophysiological system, right? And becomes very disturbing, and therefore there is an effort to represent it in a better light. For thought is under pressure to represent the situation in a better light, more favorable light. And there you see the beginning of self-deception, right? You see, now this happens all the time, you see, with your country, with your religion, and so on. You see, the country is represented as right, good people. The enemy is the opposite, is represented as the opposite, right? And it's therefore presented that way. Now, we do not notice the connection between representation and presentation, the two-way connection, right? You see, thought seems to lack the ability to see that this is happening. It's all unconscious. It must be implicit, right? Or something. Now,
It's the same process that we do when, say, we look at a tree. According to Eccles, over 50% of what's actually perceived in seeing a tree isn't just an optical nerve and that particular connection. It brings in 50% more connections from elsewhere into representation.
Yes, and we need it because we've got to recognize the tree, right? Yes, so see, we're not saying this process is bad or good, but what's wrong with it is not that it takes place, but rather we are not aware of it. And therefore we can become caught up in all sorts of confusion and self-deception. You see, now, we couldn't do without it. You see, in order to take action towards something, it's not enough to represent it in imagination or thought. You must actually feel it to be there. You see, so if you say you're focusing your attention on something to do, like if we say this is a rose, that's a representation, right? It's also a lot of other things. It's a living plant. It's a texture. It's a color. You see, by calling it a rose, you present it in a certain way to yourself. By saying, that somebody is American, that's a or English or whatever, that's a representation. You see, by saying this is a house, that's a representation, because you could say, well, it's a material structure. It could be all sorts of things. it could be represented differently. You see, like, take a forest, it could be represented as a source of lumber, and the lumberman would then perceive it, would be presented to him that way. To the artist, it could be represented as something worth painting, right? And then to a fellow who wants to take a walk, it would be represented as a place he could enjoy himself walking along the path. You see, and there are countless representations of the forest, which will present the forest in a different way and will call attention in a different way, you see. The awareness and attention are directed by the presentation, right? You know, they may be limited. Since the representation is limited, the presentation is limited, right? And therefore, if it holds your attention is limited, right? And therefore, that's as much as you can see.
It seems if there's less representation, then there should be more presentation.
Well, maybe, but see, you can't control it. We're not conscious of this process. Now, so the best thing is to sort of look at it neutrally and see what we can dig up about it, right?
Yeah. But you were saying that it wouldn't hold your interest.
Yeah, well, it won't hold your... What is not represented generally as interesting does not hold your interest. You see, if it's not represented as valuable and interesting, it is not presented that way, and therefore it doesn't hold, right? Now...
There has to be some motive implicit behind what you are looking at on some
well,
level?
not necessarily, but I'm just saying how it works. You see, saying that thought is capable of... See, thought may... In some cases, you should represent it according to your interest. You see, you may say, I need to represent it in a certain way to do something, right? And therefore, it will hold my interest and attention while I'm doing it, right? Now, none of this is wrong, you see. In fact, all of it is absolutely necessary. Unless it's presented that way, you can't take action, right? You can't just act from the representation, the abstract representation in the imagination, right? You see, you have got to act from the concrete presentation. And if you're driving a car, you know, the representation is that traffic light means stop, you know, and that certain situations are dangerous, and so on. Behind the corner may be another car. But that is presented, right? So that you can act immediately toward it without having to go through the process of thinking, which takes too much time. Now, in addition, you would never get it right anyway, you see. So if you just acted from pure thought, right? So but the thought enters into the actual experience and the actual perception, you see. And this cannot be avoided, right? Now, but the thing that goes wrong is that we are not aware that this is happening. And by and large, the human race has probably almost never been aware of it. Now, now you can see that this mistake, it's not really a mistake, it leads to a lot of mistakes, right? But this lack of attention, awareness, lack of being aware of this process is crucial. You see that it explains all the troubles we've been discussing, right? It gives
Exactly is it that we're not aware of?
that how the representation of thought enters the presentation of perception. See, if somebody says, I don't know, people of this category are bad, right? You accept that that's a representation of those people, right? Or they may be misrepresented, right? Now, you've accepted that. It's gone into the implicit thought. The next moment, it comes up when you see a person of that kind as a presentation. The badness inheres in him. It is not that you say, I know that somebody has told me that these people are bad, and and they may be bad, it may be good, I'd better look and see. But rather, what they are is apparently just right there. So apparently, from there on, you think about that as if it were entirely an independent fact, independent of thought. You see, so thought begins apparently to prove itself and create facts, right? Which are not really facts, although they are in some sense, you see. The word fact means what has been made in Latin, manufacture. So in some sense we have to establish a fact, you see, but this is being made wrong. This is a fact which is not being properly manufactured, right? It's being made in a wrong way. And you see, because we are mixing up thought into that fact and not knowing that we're doing it.
And yet you're saying this process is absolutely necessary?
It's necessary to let thought enter the fact, but what we fail to notice is that it is happening, and therefore the value of the fact must be judged according to that, right? Right? But if we say it's a pure fact, which is just there, we will give it a tremendous value. We say, how can you deny the fact? You can see what sort of people they are.
There's another fact in there, and that is that we don't experience the world out there. We experience the world in the head where all of this is occurring. The actual experience itself is in the head.
Yes,
not out there.
That's true. But we are representing it as out there, and therefore presenting it as out there.
Yeah.
You see, there's a representation of time and space, the past and the future, and we experience all that, right? You see, that's the point. Now, these representations have been largely built up collectively. We don't invent them individually.
What happens if you do invent it individual? Let's say a Chinese man hits you on the head. The next time you see a Chinese man, you have...
No, but that uses a lot of collective representations like Chinese. You see, you do a little bit with it individually, but you don't fundamentally create it. You see, you make modifications, right? You see, but being Chinese is a representation, right? You might also say you have picked on certain qualities as key importance, whereas you might say anything. Maybe he's an artist is more important, or maybe he's something else. You see, you would say, let's consider him to be a friend, you see. Therefore, that's another representation which would make you look at it very differently, right? So therefore, we have all these representations, and they may come in, and we perceive through those representations, right?
This is a function of thought, but the problem is that thought doesn't see, it thinks what it's representing and being presented with is reality.
It thinks it's an independent fact. It's a fact independent of thought. Let's leave out the word reality because it's going to, we have to discuss what that really would mean, right? Now, we'll discuss, there is the fact as presented to us, but that contains a lot of thought, which has been in the representation, and there's no reason why it shouldn't in general, but we don't know it's there.
Subliminal, or?
It's subliminal, it's unconscious, we don't exactly know how it happens.
Infrastructure?
And somewhere, I don't know, you see, we can see something must happen that the thought mixes with, if you imagine the information coming in from the senses and being a sort of organized in the brain, but then another stream of information comes from thought, and the two mix, and the net result is the result of the two, right? As somebody was remarking, half the Eccles showed half, or perhaps more than half of the activity is due to what's already in the brain. It was you, wasn't it? Yeah. And and that is inevitable, you see. Now, but the important point is we are not aware that this is happening. In fact, the human race, by and large, has seldom known this, if ever. At least has known it, perhaps in a few people, but by and large, we go ahead with that. Even though if we know it abstractly, we're not able to do anything about it, right? As we may form a concept of it, but we cannot connect that concept with what's actually happening. Right? The concept of water we can connect with what's actually happening by dealing with water, right? But this concept at the moment we don't know what to do with it, right? So but we see there's a problem there.
This ability allowed us to function in the physical world quite nicely.
Yeah.
To add qualities, to perceive qualities and stuff, but in this other realm, it seems to have led us extremely astray because we ascribe characteristics that aren't justifiable or to other people. That's how we've gotten lost in this cycle.
Yeah, if everybody agrees on the representation, we think it's right, and it's automatically applied, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't see it's a representation; we see it as the actual fact.
Gold we ascribe to represent it as a high-valued thing.
That's right.
But it only is valued because
it's represented that way. You see, but people tend to look at gold as in value. It's a fact that it's valuable. You see, independent of how. You see, it's independent of how I think, because see, it's a little difficult. Other people, even if I say gold is not very valuable, other people will still represent it that way, and therefore it will still be valuable to them. So that looks as if it's independent of me, right? But it's not independent of us collectively.
independent of this quality of the mind to represent it.
Yes, that's right. But it's done collectively. You see, the important point is that most of these representations arise collectively, and that gives them greater power because, first of all, if everybody agrees on something, we take that as evidence that it's right or could be right, and secondly, it creates a pressure on us. We don't want to get out of the consensus and so on, and and all that means that we are constantly under pressure to accept this representation and to see it that way. And see, then once it's there, we don't know what's happening, right? So we say gold has a value, money has a value, right? But it's a representation, right?
We even dream about money and finding money on the streets.
Yeah, so you see...
That's that deep. Well, I mean, I know I did as a kid. I'd walk around and find a dime in the corner. My dreaming mind would be excited about finding all this money.
So you're saying that this is what is happening with the self, anything concerning?
Yeah, the self is being represented in a certain way and therefore presented in a certain way, right? And the representation is basically collective in the sense that the general properties of the self are determined collectively, and particular details are determined individually. Right?
If I had a pot of gold, I guess I'd be guarding it somewhere, wherever it was. If I had a pot of self and myself was in there full, and any time anyone says anything or does anything to that image, I'm defending it or offensive. But if it's empty, then there's nothing. I don't have it.
Yes, but the representation is that it's there, you see. You see, and it's unconscious, and because we don't see it happening, it seems to be a fact, you see. That is, it looks just like any other fact, right? You can't distinguish it from any other fact, and therefore how are you going to know it's not there?
And if you said you didn't have a self, it doesn't mean everybody else isn't going to give you one.
Yes, the consensus all over the world is you do have one, and you're sort of standing out against it, and it's hard. And anyway, you have no evidence for the fact that there's no self because all of the evidence is you've got one.
Birth certificate.
What?
It's right there on your
Yeah,
birth
well, everybody says so. It's on your birth certificate. You've got a name. You know, you're identified. You've got an identity card. In many countries, you know, you've got a bank account. You've got money. You've got land. See, you've got possessions, profession. You see, all of this is representing what you are, right? And therefore, it is presenting what you are. You see, if you represent this land as mine, it's presented as mine. Now, if two different people represent the same land as mine, then there's a big conflict.
Well, these lives that we're living then are part fact and part fiction. Each of us is writing a novel.
Yes, but it's not a very good novel. I don't even think it's very interesting. It's always almost the same, you see. But it isn't even a great tragedy, you see.
You can see the danger of this, David, in the representation of land, for instance, in Israel, as far as the Palestinians looking at the same piece of land in a certain way and the Israelis looking at it in another way.
Yeah. They're both representing their land as ours, you see, and therefore they collide over it. Now, and you see, we can represent different values as high and fight over that. You see, we represent all sorts of things, right? And now, you see that, and you see representation like in order to have a corporation like General Motors, it's a concept. It's really a representation of General Motors creates the presentation of General Motors, and everybody's able to work for General Motors, right? Because everybody sees General Motors, right? Now, you see, this is a much nicer example of this sort of thing. Let's look at a rainbow. You see, everybody sees the same rainbow. There's a collective representation of the rainbow. We all consensus on it, right? And according to physics, which looks at things with literal thought, it says no, there's no rainbow. It says there's a lot of droplets of water, and the sun is way back in back of you, It's being refracted off the water and forming colors and each person is forming his own rainbow, right? It happens they all look very similar. Therefore they all think they're looking at the same rainbow. Right? But then you are taking physics as the real thing, and the rainbow is just in your head, right? But some people might argue even these, the raindrops are also representations and so on. The atoms are representations. They're made of atoms, and the atoms are representations and so on. You see, we can get some evidence for these representations, but they fit to some extent our experience. But the point is, though, that a lot of the collective representations are of the same quality as the rainbow. Say General Motors, for example, you see, or this country, or a religion, or the ego.
That's what I was trying to get at when I said the personalized conceptualization of reality. Each of us taking in and translating.
Yeah, but we're all doing more or less the same thing. We do it in a collectively determined way.
We see the rainbow together, okay.
We don't see it. Each one sees his own rainbow. That's
what I'm saying about what.
But they're all very similar, and we therefore think we're looking at the same rainbow. Right? But there isn't any. According to physics, there's no rainbow out there at all, anyways. That's a case of a non-fact, right, from the point of view of physics, right?
What happens to a physicist when he sees a rainbow?
Well,
It's not translated.
See, in physics, you can only explain the rainbow, you can't see it, right? They say there's nothing to see, right? The point is, though, that a great many of our things which we take as solid reality are very similar to the rainbow, and in fact, it's not even wrong to do that. You see, the thing that is. The difficulty arises because we do not realize that this is happening, and therefore give it the value of an independent fact, right? Which that means the same. That's what literal thought does, and you see, perhaps physics is still worshiping this independent fact as an idol, right? But
are you suggesting we cannot see a fact?
No, we can see a fact, but
without representation.
Well, most facts contain representation. You see, that is because you see that they focus on what constitutes the fact. There's so much going on in the immediate perception. You see, it's so concrete and rich that you wouldn't know what you're talking about, right? So, if we're going to have communication, we have got to have representation, right? Communication about this fact, a public fact, right? Now, some of these public facts may be just manufactured, like the rainbow in our heads. Others perhaps have something more outside as well. But all of them have this aspect of being focused on by thought, by the representation, and giving shape and form. The representation gives shape and form and figuration to the fact. You see, if you look at clouds, you see, well, they may have no shape at all, but then you may represent it as an animal or a tree and so on, then you feel that's what it is, right? Or if you look at the stars, people have seen all sorts of animals or gods in there represented that way, right? And it's presented that way. And so the whole fact is organized according to the representation, which happens to be significant, right, at that moment. And without that organization, we wouldn't have any fact we could talk about or communicate. You see, so certainly facts about things are organized that way. You see, that we focus and call this a thing separate from that is due to our representation, you see. And I could represent that as a molecular structure or as a beam, you see. Now, from the point of view of molecular structure, its being a beam is not very significant. It's just a shape, it's a form attached to it, right? But from the point of view of building the building, it's very significant, right? You wouldn't try to build it by representing it as a molecular structure. So we have all kinds of representations which enable us to see, having represented this as a beam which has certain qualities conceptualized, then we can make plans and move the beam from here to there and do things with it, right? Which will fit, right? So if the concept is correct. And so now we have to go into all that, but one point is then that we are in trouble here because this is happening. It absolutely has to happen, and yet we cannot see it happening. If we could see it happening, it would produce no problem at all. We would then be able to value the fact for whatever it is. But this way we are able to take facts which have very little value and value them very highly. For example, we could take the rainbow and say there's a pot of gold at the end of it, or we could say the nation is created by this sort of fact, right? It has very little, everything else follows from this. See, some facts may apparently have some independence, at least like the beam or the molecules, but the fact of the nation or the fact of General Motors arises only from the concept, right? But we treat it as if it were there in nature, you see. So that gives it a very high value, saying this is real, it's very important, you see, this is something of great value. Now, what we should go back to the representation and ask, is this a correct representation that has helped to produce this fact, you see? In other words, we can't really understand it properly without understanding that it comes from a representation, which could be correct or incorrect in this case. Now, therefore, to make sense of all this, there seems to be something, we require something that seems to be missing.
A correct or incorrect representation?
For a certain purpose, you see.
Oh, okay, okay.
You see, it all depends on your interest, your purpose, and so on. You see, because there are an infinity of representations, no limit. And according to your interest, your purpose, your value, you use a representation, you see. It sort of comes in, now mostly unconsciously. And then it is possible to have wrong representations of the fact, you see. And in fact, we're saying the ego is itself a wrong representation. Now, if we call that if we said that this beam was as strong as steel, represented it that way, that would be incorrect. And if we build a building on that basis, it might collapse. Right? And perhaps, misrepresentations of construction materials have led to bridges collapsing, you see. In other words, people wanted to save money and said this stuff is just as good as steel. Or else there was a famous case in England in the 19th century, the bridge where they had iron or steel beams and they cut out a large part of them and filled it with wax, which looked like steel. And the bridge duly collapsed with a lot of people on it. So you see, that misrepresentations can be very serious. Right? Now,
Is it fair to say that what we're doing is we're taking the explicit order as if it were the implicit order?
Yes, as if it were even deeper, as if it were really just what is there, right? You see, we're saying, here is this representation, and we're saying that's just what it is. Now, we're not even doing it consciously. That's where the problem is. It just seems to be presented as part of the fact, you see. In other words, we do not see how the fact is made, right? Now, the fact that the word fact means to make is a kind of clue, right? That it's what has been made, what has been done, you see, and what's actually so. And the point is, is it really made truly, or is it being made by putting wax in there instead of iron, you see? And now, see, what are we going to do then? There seems one view might be, as one gentleman said, that there may be something missing in our brains, right? That it won't show this thing going on. If so, then well, we just have to live with that, or perhaps we won't live with it, right? But it may not be so. You see, now, let's see if we can explore it a bit further. And the one point is now that we can begin to think about the way the representations work. We can form a See, we have thought of type A, which represents all sorts of things, right? Including, all buildings and people and physics and chemistry and all that, and politics and everything, right? And companies, money. And then we take representations of type B, which represent how representations are working, right? You see, we're going from thought type A to thought of type B, right? Saying that we are at least conscious of the fact that there is this problem, right? that something is going on. Now, see, if we could form an adequate or correct representation of what's going on, this might change the presentation. You see, maybe the reason it's not being presented in perception, what's going on, is that we are already presenting a false picture of what's going on, right? A wrong fact. Right? We have already made the assumption that what's going on is independent of thought. It's being represented that way, saying, my experience and perception is one thing and my thought is another. Now, that representation is presented immediately in perception, so it is already being presented that way. There's no room for you to see what's happening, right? It's already excluded. You cannot pay attention to what is outside the representation. There's a tremendous pressure. It's very hard. The only time you can pay attention to it is when you see there's trouble, right? When the surprise comes, when there's a contradiction, you know, when things don't quite work, right? Like, or else when there's some puzzle, like with Helen Keller, right? So we're saying when things are going smoothly, there's no way even to know that there's anything wrong. And we're saying we may have a wrong representation of thought. Our present thought process contains not only this, but a vast number of wrong representations of itself, which make for wrong presentations, which muddle it all up, right? Because everything will act according to how it's presented, you see. Whatever you do with it is exactly according to how it's presented. It cannot be otherwise. So if it's presented wrongly, your action is going to be wrong. So therefore, we have this fact that thought, it's a very subtle point, right? That thought has been misrepresenting itself to itself, right? And therefore presenting itself wrongly in consciousness. Now, can we criticize this, bring it to light, and perhaps propose other representations, not necessarily finally correct, but just simply to see how it all works, right? That we are forming thought of type B, which begins to look at how representations work. It forms a representation of how representations work, which will change the presentation.
Bring it to light because you've made me aware, at least, that it's now a problem. It isn't just something going smoothly. And I see a problem that I didn't see before, and now I'm aware of it.
Yes, there is a problem. There is a problem, you see, there is a difficulty.
I wouldn't say it's a problem, I would say it's a question.
Well, whatever, we don't call it a problem, a difficulty, a question. Things are not working right, you see. Let's say we're putting it that way. And we're beginning to see where it's going wrong, but not getting, not able really to change it yet. But we're saying we're getting some sort of feeling for where it's going wrong. Namely, that a lot of what we take to be a fact is well, it's not really a fact, right? In other words, the facts from which we start are themselves deceptive. The facts about ourselves and about all these other things which we're talking about. You see, so with the aid of this thought of type B, we are beginning to be able to look at it. You see, that we become aware that there is a problem here. I don't call it a problem, a contradiction, a difficulty. And I won't call it a problem because I have no idea how to solve it. You see, you can't project a solution. You see, one of our representations is that everything that we do is done in time. We project all and we find this end. Therefore, everything is extended that way. It's something that could be handled that way. See, all the things we're talking about for are the result of the misrepresentation of itself, and therefore the wrong presentation of what's going on. So that, then you can see that the self-deception comes about almost automatically. Right? That if thought presents the thought-felt process, see, every representation contains felts as well as thoughts. Is that clear? I mean, your values of it, your attitude to it, and so on, and they go into the presentation. So you get not only the way it looks and the shape and the form, but also the feeling. Right?
This idea of time is also misrepresented.
Well, it has its correct points, but it's being misrepresented psychologically, right? You see that time is a representation of process, right? The order of succession in process. Time is known by thought, right? You see, we don't experience time. We'll come to that later, but time is a form of thought, and time is a thought about a process, you see, which has a successive order. And that representation as does thought of space. And therefore it becomes the presentation. And whatever doesn't fit that, there's no way to pay attention to it. Not at present, anyway. It's as if it were not there.
We'll also run into the problem when all that we know about the subject is what we read in books or talk with others, or the inner process that we do about what we've read and talked to others about. And so we're talking about thinking, and we don't ever touch the reality of the thing at all. And we can get into trouble that way.
Yes, well, but you see, but all these things that we learn in books and so on become part of our representation and enter our experience and our facts, right? And now the question is, what does the word reality mean? You see, which is another, we'd have to go into that, because we have to say that there's a representation of what is real and what is not real, you see. And I don't think we can do that this evening, but just simply to raise the question, don't accept the word reality too uncritically either, because that's involved in here, you see.
The B is a distorting process.
What?
The B type of...
Yeah. Well, no, B, no, B helps us to, no, it's A which is caught up in it, and B is helping us to be aware that it's happening, you see.
It's like, how can we look at something we haven't experienced?
Well, we have seen it indirectly. You see, look, we're approaching, making a different approach. You see, suppose we go into, the nearest analogy I could think of is in science. People made a theory of the gravity and of the planets, you see, and there were a certain number of planets, right? Now, they found that the planets were not moving exactly the way they ought to move, right? So they said that could be explained by saying there's another planet out there. And they looked for it and found it, right? You see, I'm saying that by this representing the thing in a certain way, they were able to look differently, you see. Now, that doesn't mean that, but previously they weren't looking that way because they represented it differently. They see, when you had the theory that there are 7 planets, that's all. Therefore, that's how it's presented. There are only 7 planets, so you won't look for the 8th, right? Because it's got to be 7. Now, what we're doing is using a certain amount of inference by thought about thought. You see, the point is, if you can, with material objects, we all agree that we can think about them and make representations of them, and in certain areas that works. Huh? It helps give us some insight, right? Now, here, what I'm saying, thought is also, to a large extent, a material process, if not entirely, I don't know. So why can't we do that with thought? You see, we're not going to say it's a great spiritual thing that could never be thought about. You know, it's ineffable. You see, thought is not ineffable, you see. Now, therefore, we can work with it with thought, right? Now, we're saying it's something that's going on, and some scientists might even say that it's just a material process. I mean, we needn't make our judgment on that, but they believe that you're going to have artificial intelligence, you see. I would question that, but but in any case, it has a large aspect of a material process, right? And that aspect can be studied, you see, or can be thought about, or can be looked at in the way we might do anything like that. Now, so we're saying thought of type B is investigating thought, primarily thought of type A, right? It's not investigating a great spiritual mystery, you see, going into the unknown or anything like that. Now, and we're saying that people have begun to use thought of type B in becoming aware that there is this difficulty. And you can see now that by focusing your attention this way, that you understand what the source of the problem is, or don't call it a problem, what the source of the trouble is, right? That it is because we are not aware of how representations enter presentations. But we are beginning to get at least a faint awareness of it, you see. Because we can at least see how it has happened. After it's happened, we can see that it has happened. Okay? And we can begin to make representations of that. Now, but you can see that suppose, now let me just engage in a little fantasy. Suppose we solve all this and say, suddenly we learn how to see thought actually producing from presentations from representations. We would no longer be fooled by it, right? It would be like seeing the trick of the magician, you see. As long as you don't see what the magician is doing, it seems magic, right? That, you see, therefore, if we had that perception, that direct insight, like Helen Keller had a direct insight into how the concept works, right? Which changed her life. If we had a direct insight into how this process is working, it would change everything, right? It would be a concept of concepts and beyond, right? You see that it would show the concept working in perception, and perception in the concept. And you see, those things which have been separated would now be united, and they would participate in each other, right? They would be seen that way. They are doing so anyway, but there's a participation going on we don't see. We're taking it as non-participation, right? That is, we are representing it as non-participation, and therefore presenting it as the thought is not participating in perception. But thought is participating, and perception is obviously participating in thought, right? Because thought is affected by what we perceive.
I have a question that statement that it would change everything. That may be too sweeping.
Well, it would change things radically, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, let's put it.
Well, I say that because one might get the notion that then paradise, and that might be quite an error.
No, let's say there would be a radical change in that, in my view, for the better. By removing all this illusion and confusion and self-deception and so on.
But I mean, that might be seen, and it's still, it may continue to.
Yeah, well, let's try to put it that if we really see it, how it's working, it won't continue. You see, let me try to put it that it's because you don't see the whole end, to the end that things continue. You see that what?
The question is not answered, right? That's what you want to say.
Well, yes. If you can actually see yourself producing that perception, whatever it may be, you will value it properly. You see, I think that everything goes according to what you actually see, right? The entire system. And if you see wrongly or illusorily, it goes in that way, right? Now, if you see correctly, it goes in another way. Now,
I thought you were saying that if you see illusorily, that you can see that you are seeing.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
Okay, it's not that you cannot see with illusion necessarily, but you are seeing your.
Yeah, but something will happen when you see that this is an illusion. Almost immediately, it will lose its value.
Right, and then the illusion will
And
disappear.
therefore, that will all disappear, right? It will stop doing it.
I again would question that may be seen, and everything is different than, after that. Nevertheless, there's a tremendous momentum within that movement, which
Yeah, well, let me put it,
clear.
it's like the discovery that a few uranium nuclei disintegrate. Right? It may seem very unimportant. At first, very little happens, right? But it opens the way to something great, right?
I made that point because it seems to me, in thinking about this thing, we can get the notion that somewhere along here is this insight that we can have, and then freedom. And I think that's erroneous.
Well, it may be erroneous, you see, but let me propose more likely is that we will see the essence of it, and from there it will move into our life, you see. Now,
It's part of our thinking.
Yeah, part of our thinking and feeling and perceiving. Because in other words, our whole perception will change because we are going to cease to mistake representations for independent facts.
Sorry once again.
Right.
That we see this, but that doesn't mean that forever after we will cease to make that misrepresentation.
No, well, we may fall into it again, I don't know, you see, but let me say that there will be a radical change, that's all. Now, there's no way to guarantee perfection in life, you see. That's what I think, anyway. Now, therefore, there may be difficulties arising later, but what we will do is open up a very creative area far beyond what we're doing now. In other words, we can, for example, I think it opens the way to ending all these problems we've been talking about, of nationalism and this and pollution and all that. You see, all of these arise because people do not see that the facts which they see are produced by their representation. The fact of the value of their nation or their religion or their money or whatever. And therefore, you see, for example, you may say, okay, I understand people are still valuing money, but I see fundamentally that that it's a representation, right? And I say people are still valuing nationalism, but I see fundamentally it's a representation. And if we get this perception very strong, it will spread, you see, because just as the uranium nuclei start to affect the others, they call it a chain reaction. It's communicable, you see. Just as disease is communicable, we could say health is communicable. That both are the result of certain patterns of thought, right? You see, patterns of action of the mind. Now, therefore, if we have this new way of acting of the mind, it's communicable. Now, if there's a lot of energy in it, it will really communicate. See, I think it will liberate a lot of energy. And if you have a considerable number of people who would be able to do this, it would liberate it. It would really communicate. You see, on a level which we find it hard to imagine. You see that it's because people are stuck in this thing partly because they believe nothing else is possible. You see, that's part of the representation. It is represented as absolute necessity. Therefore, presented as absolute necessity. It's saying, I see nothing else is possible. I feel nothing else is possible, right? It can only go on this way.
You're saying then that the source of the contributory of pollution is the representation of
Yeah. Well, I'm representing, look, what am I doing? If I'm running a factory, I represent my job as what? To produce a profit as quickly as I can, right? As much as I can. And it's not my business to think about what happens to the product, to the waste products, right? I'm saying that has nothing to do with me. So that's presented. That's the way I see it. Everybody's doing that. Therefore, we accumulate pollution, right? It's just ordinary pollution. Now, one country says it's not our business to think about the welfare of the people in the other country. It's our affair to think of our own people, right? And that's represented that way. Now, it turns out that we may depend on what they do, but still, that hardly penetrates, right? You know, we may notice that somebody may say so and say, yes, how interesting, but the next minute you've forgotten, right? Because it's represented as absolute necessity. My country, we come first, right? Number one comes first, you know. But the priorities are the values, right? So we have a situation which has certain values.
Wouldn't we have to change drastically our values then?
Well, they would change, you see, because we would see that the values are based on certain representations of what things are. See, the value of putting yourself first is based on the representation. You are a separate entity who is of that nature. Now, if you see that, that is the result of a false representation itself, right? So,
Is it like the emperor has no clothes?
Yes, that's the same thing. You see, everybody represented the emperor as having clothes. You see, so therefore it was presented as having clothes until somebody who didn't represent it saw it otherwise.
And like a epidemic was catching one brain after the other.
What?
Like a disease.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it goes from virus, one person to another, you see, now.
Is the immediacy...
What was that?
Is the immediacy that we've discussed, in other words, not happening in time, what connection would that have between consciousness and light?
Well, I don't know, you see, but we could discuss that tomorrow. That, see, the presentation aims would be immediate, whereas the representation is mediated. It takes time, right? But it becomes part of the immediate. You see, we should discuss that tomorrow. You see that that we are not. We have got to represent this feature of thought to ourselves better. You see, and now the point is then that if we go into bring out the misrepresentation of thought, which is collective, and see if we can see a better representation, which will make a better presentation, and which will make a better action. Because every action is according to the immediate presentation of the whole. You see, it cannot be otherwise, right? Whatever you choose to do, it cannot be otherwise than that. You see, you cannot go against the way it's presented.
If I may bring up something just to make it a little clearer for myself. We spoke earlier that, let's say that we're all here in this room and we're listening to this, and we can see how this misrepresentation goes into the presentation, and I'm kind of getting an inkling of what's going on here. And in this stream that we've talked about with the source, let's say I don't want to change, that I see something going on. I can see this process, but I don't want to change that because it will change. I don't want to change. Let's say I just don't want to change.
Yeah,
Are you
yeah.
saying that's above? That's above in the stream?
No, it's a part of part of the collective representation, which says that we've got to protect this self above all. That's first priority, right?
So are you saying that if we start looking at this misrepresentation, that is above that feeling, perhaps?
Yes, the misrepresentation of the self is behind the trouble. If we were free of that misrepresentation, we wouldn't try to protect it, because it's nothing, you see.
There's been some work recently done that shows that the synaptic endings and the axons and the neurons actually resolder, change themselves. And this idea of a perception, if it's something new, to be aware of the misrepresentation, it's almost as if there's a group of cells formed, connected to give it this concept that it has a higher influence on all the lower layers of our conditioning and our memory. It's like it repolarizes or has a feedback effect to diminish it or to change it in some way, so it's not as dogmatic or as fixed as it has been.
Yes.
That feeling from
Yeah, well, that's the beginning. You see, that's the first few uranium atoms disintegrating, right? You see, the point is that we've applied this notion to a few simple cases, which are sort of mostly outside of us. But going further, getting more feeling for this notion, you begin to see how it works inside of us and between us, right? In communication and dialogue. And you see that this question of representation is crucial in our communication. You see, suppose we say everybody who came here came with certain representations about what other people are like and so on, or what I'm like, and vice versa. And you see, now as we communicate, you see, we may find these representations get shaken and change, right? And therefore the presentation changes, and therefore the whole relationship changes. So the relationship is according to how we present ourselves, how we present other people to ourselves, and how we present ourselves to other people, right? And that depends on the general collective representation going all around. See, so if we begin to touch on these things which are more immediate, see, we've touched on things which are far away first. Well, that was inevitable because it's much easier to see it there. It doesn't threaten us so much. We mustn't berate ourselves for saying we have avoided the problem, you see, but rather you begin first on that, like you first begin to ride your bicycle in a quiet place or your car, not in the middle of a lot of traffic, you see. Therefore, we're saying here we have, suppose we're saying we've been looking at it in this way, which of things outwardly, because we can see the pattern there, you see. Now then we say, but this pattern applies inwardly and also between us, right? And that the representation of ourselves as separate comes from this literal thinking. You know, in other words, that's a general misrepresentation. To apply literal thinking is absolutely correct, right? And and now, if we begin to see this thing weakening and dissolving, then it becomes possible to see room for participation, right? Whereas if we hold to that other misrepresentation, it shows no room. It says that there's no place for participation. You can't do it. It's impossible. And it's presented that way, saying everybody is another separate atom, and how can you have this participation? So, therefore, I think that we're beginning to point. See, by looking at this thing and things where we find it easier to look at, we're beginning to point to where the trouble is. And I think what has been proposed here is an adequate explanation of the trouble. Now, we have not yet seen how we're going to get out of it, but say maybe that first little feeling about it is that.
You're in type 2 thinking, is that how you put it?
Yeah, type B or
type
2,
B
whatever you
thinking. That is not yet perceiving reality. I'm asking that. I'm not telling.
Well, it's still type B thinking, and it has begun slightly to shake our perception of reality. You see, but we're saying really we have to put a lot more energy into it. Right? No, that was said there. See, what happens is that we're dissolving away this misrepresentation. The presentation changes, and when to the extent the presentation changes, you are different. Right? You are the world as presented to you. You see.
Did you say that again?
What? Well, you see, your whole being is determined by how everything, the world and yourself is presented, right, in consciousness. You cannot act otherwise than that way, right? According to that. Therefore, when the presentation changes, you are different, you see.
Now one could, I assume, deceive oneself. I wonder if there's some kind of proprioceptive quality that one can sense. I don't know, but you could change and start feeling, quote, loving, and fool yourself.
Oh yeah.
And get it. I think we're all getting together. There's.
Yeah, well, we have to be careful about misrepresentation. You see, that's still another form of it, that you could just misrepresent and say, we're all loving one another and it's all solved and so on, you see. And that could be presented that way, and we could get a nice glow. But yeah.
And nothing's changed. Right?
Yeah, so we have to be careful, and watch that. But saying that doesn't still change the fact that any real change in presentation, a genuine change in presentation, is a change of being. The world, see, when the world is presented to you differently, you are different. I mean, the world also includes yourself, right?
Are you saying that when we discuss things, that you also see the world different through our discussions? Does it
to some extent, as it penetrates, it implies a different way of seeing the world. We haven't gone into that, right? But it implies, what is said here implies that our whole way of seeing the world can change, right? You see, that we see the world according to the general collective representations that are circulating around our society and culture. And insofar as these are dropped, then we have changed, right? Because the world is then presented differently, and we act according to how it's presented. See, for example, if somehow you are presented to me as a dangerous person, then I will sort of shrink back. I can't help it. But if I suddenly don't represent you differently, then my whole approach is different. You see, now suppose all of us are in that boat, and it all changes, right? You see, so we begin with a representation which is current in our society that you have to take care of yourself, watch out. People are dangerous, you can't trust them. You've got to take care of number one first, and so on, right? That is the representation of society and of the individual. Now, that will produce a response, right? Both, not only outwardly, but inwardly. The whole neurochemistry is accordingly. The whole tension in the body is accordingly. Now, you see, let's say, engage in fantasy again. Say, look, suppose you went to a planet where everybody was trustworthy and friendly and loving and intelligent. You see, I think your whole picture of the world would change, and you would find yourself changing, right?
Everybody always says, I would change if the world would change.
Well, that's what I said. Yeah.
Say, well, I'd like to be loving, but it's a dangerous world.
Yeah, that's right. But we were representing the world as dangerous, you see. Now, it's true the world is dangerous, but we have it wrong. It's dangerous not because people are intrinsically dangerous, but because of misrepresentation that has been accepted. See, we have to see the right reason, saying, therefore, if we're going to approach it, we don't approach these people as intrinsically dangerous, but as people who are victims of misrepresentation.
Including their own misrepresentation.
Yes, right. Therefore, the change is to change the representation. Not to
reinforce it.
Yes. You see, but it opens the way in saying that these people, all of us, can change, but we don't say it's going to be easy or hard, or we don't know, but it opens up the way, like saying once you see that uranium nuclei can disintegrate, it opens up a big perspective.
In one sense, we can't say that the world is dangerous. In another sense, to me, the world will always be dangerous. And so far as I am me, separate and isolate, there will always be a danger.
But then that's a representation, you see. So I'm trying to say all of that could probably change, right?
Yeah.
You see.
But then, if this me isn't here, was the world ever dangerous in the first place?
Maybe not. No, you see
dangerous now?
See, the world goes according to there may be an infinity of worlds possible for us according to how they're represented, right? See, maybe I'm trying to say that's why I said don't accept the notion of reality too uncritically. This is a very subtle notion, right? Which we may discuss tomorrow in more detail. You can't do it quickly. That the notion that there is a unique world may not be right. You see. Yeah, a unique possible world, right? Uniquely possible world. That many worlds are possible. You see, and it all depends on the whole representation, especially the collective representation. To make a world takes more than one person in a way, and therefore the collective representation is the key. It's not enough merely for one person to change his representation. That's the one uranium nucleus disintegrating, that's fine, but we're saying that the real change is the change of collective representation.
And obviously changing our concepts doesn't change that.
No, because they're still within the general framework of the collective representation. You see, it's the worst part of the framework is that we are representing our perception is not affected by our representations, by our thought, right? We're saying the perception gives us the fact independent of thought always.
When you say there's perhaps no unique world,
Yeah.
is that similar to saying there perhaps is no objective world?
Well, no totally objective world, right? That we have to discuss what is the meaning of objective and subjective, you see, within this new view, right?
Yes.
Things change. You see that it doesn't mean what it meant in the other view.
Right.
There's a place for those terms, but it has a different meaning.
Will we go into that tomorrow?
Yeah.
But then you said yesterday, there is then a virus, and we have to, maybe it's more clear to be understood if we say that we, mankind, we are sick. It's a disease.
Yes, it's a disease, but it's a disease in knowledge.
An insidious disease of thought.
Yes, it's thought and knowledge that are disease, not, you see.
I never thought that
But you
thought
see-
can be sick.
Yes, but even now the computers get viruses, you see. You see, they get sick too.
Mental hospitals only.
What?
But we don't know that happens from the moment we are born.
Yes, it's the whole, collectively we are sick, the society is sick.
I would much rather say it's just we're not sick, it's just a teaching, it's a lesson for us.
What?
I just like to say it's a very appropriate lesson. It's a teaching. I don't like to look at it as a disease.
Well, don't look at it that way, but we say something has gone wrong. But you see, you could look at it as disease, right? If something is not right, you see, we're saying there's a problem here, trouble here, right?
If I choose to believe it's not right, it will not be right. And if
No,
I
but-
choose- But what I'm saying is, I mean, and I think you've dealt with this, I mean, because I agree with.
Well, it's not comfortable to think that we are sick.
I don't look, I mean, disease is part of health.
What?
Disease is part of health.
Yes, well, we could say that, you see that,
But I'm just looking at it, the fact that once we have, as you and Krishnamurti, as well as anybody in the history of the world, I think, has pointed out, that we're stuck in this self-conscious reality. We deal with this duality problem, right? And we've got to have wrong to see right. We've got to have bad to see good. And what you're really getting at here is that you're getting at a way to transcend that.
yes.
Another way, I see, like, even in your theories, quantum theory and relativity, within a self-conscious reality, there are apparently three characteristics of each one of them that appear to be different. But in a self-conscious reality, that's all you could end up with. It's just like the yin-yang symbol. I look at it. And so, and in that sense, I just don't like to use the word wrong, because that word is another mask. Each word is a mask, as you've well pointed out here in the last hour. So
Yeah, well, you could criticize it. I say, let's say we could use it and then see its limits. You see that in a certain language we could say society is sick, right? Or it's really knowledge and thought that are sick. As as computers can be sick in a certain sense too, right? Now now in another sense it would be better not to say that, because it's pejorative. It creates a condemnation and a bad inside feeling. You see, it makes an attack on it. So we could say, let's say that we have, if we just say simply there's a misrepresentation.
There's a conflict.
Well, it will bring a conflict. Misrepresentation brings about a conflict, right?
Well, we just haven't arrived there yet. We're just beginning to get into that
Yeah.
position to see that, which isn't, there's no fault in that.
No, well, you see, we're saying we have been caught in a misrepresentation, which we couldn't do anything about, you see, because now we were sort of picked it up when we were born from the society, or maybe, who knows how. And now we're beginning to be aware that there is this misrepresentation of how thought is working. And this seems to be an adequate explanation for all the things we've been talking about. Well, now, therefore, now, if you were in science, you would say, if you have adequately explained all the things that were puzzling you, that suggests you may well be on the right track. You see. No, and therefore it's worth going on. That's the sort of attitude I'm proposing. Now, so we continue to inquire and explore, and saying that we can use words which have a value judgment, and sick has a value judgment, which creates a kind of attack on it. You see, which interferes with perception. It interferes with the fact. You see, it enters. It's a representation that enters the fact, right? And makes it hard to, and it changes, distorts the fact. Now, so we can first of all use the word sick and see it has a certain meaning, and then say, well, it's limited, and it would be better to say it's a misrepresentation. Now, which has produced all these things we're talking about now, and then I think we go on with this tomorrow. A lot of questions have arisen, and beside that, we want to get. I think that this is tied up to the question of the unlimited or the infinite. In other words, a certain misrepresentation of that question is still here. You see, which has to be cleared up. You see that plays a key part. That the presentation of consciousness depends crucially on the representation of the unlimited. Although nobody may even think of it consciously, a person may not, but still he's affected implicitly and unconsciously by what collectively society is doing with this.
I would like to say that the word, the diagnosis for disease, watching what the reactions are in my organism, it may strengthen the vital force of the immune system, just that there is something wrong and maybe healing and powers of the organism come up. But if I just don't, it's not pleasant that I want to make the diagnosis I'm sick or my thought is diseased. And it's very flattering to say that no, it's okay. I feel I value highly my thought, which never thought to doubt it. Once I come to the point to doubt it, not to trust the thought, and not only that, to go a little bit deeper, that maybe my thought has that disease, which is an insidious disease. Well, maybe the immune system is going to become stronger, and that diagnosis can be the first healing step.
Well, you can call it a disease. We could say it's like a disease. It has a resemblance to a physical disease in many ways, right? That would be correct, I think. On the other hand, I think, you see, the ultimate diagnosis is not to say there is a disease, but to say a certain process is not working right. You see, you may say cancer is a disease, but until you understand what's going on in cancer, it doesn't help you, right? You see, so later we say cancer consists of cells growing, proliferating without order, right, of the body. You see, that's a more accurate representation. Now, and therefore it provides for more insight into how to treat it. So that's what I would say. The first thing is to notice it's like a disease. That's correct. But even disease should not be cannot be treated if we don't go further than that. Even physical disease, we have to say represent the disease as really the real thing that's happening.
Usually a malfunction.
Yes, it's not functioning properly.
Start watching it closer.
Yes, that's right. But we represent this disease, and then we don't have to condemn it. See, in the early days, people said cancer is a disease. It's terrible. You see, and it actually prevented people from doing anything about it. Now. Later, people said, okay, it's a fact, it's cancer, and then they began to say what's going on, right?
There was a program 2 weeks ago in Houston on TV. It was some psychiatrist, and there was phone in, and I phoned in and asked the question. They were talking about psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, and my question was, I asked them, is there any use, what use has psychoanalysis as far as ever helping a patient? Because in the program, each psychiatrist had mentioned on 3 different occasions that they're treating a patient for 2 or 3, 4 months or whatever, therapy, 2 or 3 times a week, and it's only one day when the patient comes in and he is aware somehow in himself that he, yes, has anxiety or he has psychosis or he has whatever it was. It's when the patient is aware within himself, he sees something deeper in himself, that the patient is instantly changed on that next visit. And it seems as if what it may have to do in an unconscious way with communication of dialogue, but it seems that when the patient is aware himself, he automatically is beginning to be healed. That's the first step.
Yes, well, I would say that's so. I mean, that really was where we're at, saying some awareness of what's going on. But I think we should really finish it now because it's way past the time.